The Himalayas have long been an area which have attracted famous travellers, explorers and anthropologists. And among these, one remembers the names of Francis Hamilton, Brian Hodgson, Joseph Hooker, Sven Hedin, J.H. Hutton. And perhaps the last of this great series of explorers and anthropologists, all curiously beginning with the letter H, is Professor Christoph von Furer-Haimendorf, the Emeritus Professor of Asian Anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And I would now like to introduce Professor Haimendorf and to talk to him in the following minutes about his work and life in India and in Nepal. Professor Haimendorf, you were born in 1909 in Vienna, and you went to university in Vienna. I wondered what courses you did at Vienna.
In the University of Vienna, the courses in anthropology are fairly comprehensive. Namely, one doesn't only study anthropology, you also, which is there, was then called ethnology, but also you have to take other subjects. So I did archaeology and also physical anthropology. It's quite useful afterwards if you have some idea about these neighboring disciplines. And people ask me often, we were in Vienna, I mean, was then Austria, which had become small, it was not a colonial power. Why were you so interested in doing anthropology? Actually, I got to anthropology through India. As a schoolboy at the age of 15, 16, I got very interested in India. I read Tagore, I read about Gandhi and so on. So I thought, well, if I take anthropology, I might have the chance once to go to India. So it really is, India was the first interest, and from that I got onto anthropology.
That's exactly the question in my mind. Which were the people who influenced you most during your courses?
Well, the anthropology in Vienna at the time was under the influence of what was called the Kulturkreislehre. I mean, the theory about the circles of different cultures. There's no good English translation of Kulturkreislehre. And the two figures who were there most interested was Professor Wilhelm Schmidt, who is a great linguist, and I think now, but perhaps more known for his linguistic work. And then there was the head of the Institute of Völkerkunde, Institute of Ethnology, as one would translate it, who was Professor Koppers. But apart from these two, there was also Professor Heine Geldern, and he had perhaps the most lasting influence on me, because he was mainly interested in Southeast Asia, and he was a great archaeologist. He had done hardly any anthropological fieldwork, but he was very well known for his archaeological work. And I think it was due to Heine Geldern that ultimately I chose the extreme northeast of India for my first field work, namely the Naga Hills. I think without Heine Geldern, I perhaps wouldn't have come to this particular area, which I found then afterwards extremely rewarding.
You did a doctoral thesis at Vienna. What was the subject of that thesis?
Yes, that also had something to do with that area. It was a comparative study of hill tribes in Assam and Burma, and with the main kind of interest in their social organization, political organization, etc. Now, that would, to present day British academic audience, sounds strange that you write about people whom you have not seen, because by that time I had not been to India or Southeast Asia. But the Austria of the interwar years between the two great wars was then very short of funds for fieldwork. And so people usually did their doctorate first, and if they were successful in that, they then managed perhaps to get funds. So I went through the literature on these tribes. So when I then finally got there, I really knew quite a lot about them. That was the one advantage. And there was also one other interesting, which might be interesting, feature in, you asked me before about the courses in anthropology, is that it was a very kind of wide coverage, which is not very common nowadays anymore. Namely, you didn't from the beginning only deal with India or only deal with Africa. You had to have a sort of broad knowledge of the whole world, more or less. I mean, you had now and then a course of lectures on South America, on North America, on Africa, and so on. So you perhaps didn't know as much as a student in a British university might know about his particular field, like Africa, but one had a very wide view and could probably then choose your area with the idea that that is what interests me most. There are other possibilities too, but that would be the most interesting. And I think it was in this way that I approached Southeast Asia and hills of Assam and finally the Nagas. At that time I also wasted a lot of time once in 2 years in trying to learn Chinese, because Heine Gelden thought then one could also read the Chinese literature on Southeast Asia. That was, of course, was a hopeless thing, because you can't just do Chinese in addition to anthropology.
Was that during the time that you were a University of Vienna research assistant?
Yes, that was at that time.
That was between 1931 and 1934?
Yes.
Then you did finally receive some research funds to go to India. Who funded you?
I got that from the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation at that time gave funds to countries which had been badly hit by the war beforehand, which were short of funds, and consequently University of Vienna got some Rockefeller funds. And that enabled me first to come to England for some time, because the Rockefeller Foundation rightly thought that people should have a wider view of university studies on the area with which they would be dealing. So I was given the choice where to go. I think the university, the Rockefeller Foundation, they expected me to say Harvard or Yale or Berkeley perhaps, but I thought, no, if I want to go to India, I must go to London, which was quite correct, of course. So I came to London and I spent 2 terms at the London School of Economics and joined the famous seminar of Professor Bronislaw Malinowski.
What was that seminar?
That was the sort of general postgraduate, I had already my doctorate then, kind of postgraduate seminar, and that was in 1935 and 1936, the autumn term and the spring term. And so I met there most of the anthropologists really, or future anthropologists of Britain, like Raymond Firth and Barry Ford, I think, was there too, and quite a number of Audrey Richards and Chapera. So by the time many years later, I came back to London, to the university, I had a lot of contacts already.
And then after London, you set off for India. You went first, you sailed by boat, the Victoria, and then you went to India and you first stayed at the Viceregal Lodge with Lord Linlithgow. That must have been an interesting experience.
It was a very interesting and extremely lucky incident, really. And if I may be a bit frivolous over that, it was due to a friendship I had before I left in London with a young girl whom I had met at a ball at the Austrian embassy. And she happened to be a friend of the Linlithgows. And when I said that I was going to India, she said, "Oh, I've got friends that are going too. The father is going as viceroy, so I'm sure they would put you up." So I had the great advantage, which in India, which at that time was obviously extremely conservative, and it was very necessary. You had to have the right connections. So I at once started with being known as a friend of the viceroy.
Well, that got you a certain way. You then went on by train to Assam, which was where you were going to work, and you travelled to meet someone who was going to have a great influence on you. That was the district commissioner, Mills, at Kohima. Could you say anything about Mills, who would later have a great influence on you?
Well, that was another lucky incident, namely that at the time when I was in London, J.P. Mills, Philip Mills, he was on leave in London, so somebody put me in touch with him, and we got on very well, and he told me both about what I would find in the Naga Hills and promised to help. And again, that was immensely valuable, because Mills was at that time Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills district, and had worked among the Nagas already for many years, had written 2 books, the Ao Nagas and the Lota Nagas. His third book was coming out at that time. I remember he showed me the proofs. He was an absolutely charming person and quite a scholar, and also a great friend of the Nagas and a very good administrator. He had been in the Naga Hills already as a junior officer. He was subdivisional officer in Mokochung when Hutton, who later became professor of anthropology in Cambridge, J.H. Hutton, was deputy commissioner in Kohima. So there were these 2 British officers who both had a great interest in anthropology, and they worked together. I'm always annoyed now when I see films like film on Gandhi, and also other films where the British officers are described as extremely unsympathetic and stiff and rigid in their views. I must say this is totally different from what I have experienced, not only in Assam, in other parts of India too. I thought that among the Indian civil service, there were so many people who were scholarly, who were most sympathetic to Indians, and who had made really a great contribution, not only to the administration of India, but also to our knowledge of India. I mean, what these ICS officers wrote and published is far more than what many of their Indian colleagues did.
Yes, I was going to ask you about others like Grigson and so on later. But you arrived at Kohima, and Mills immediately swept you off on a 2-week tour with him. This was your first arrival, having come from Vienna and the London School of Economics in the field, among a people who you later described as the naked Nagas, people entirely different. I wondered if you could just say something about if you recall your first reactions in arriving in Nagaland.
Well, it was a very great experience. I mean, having always read about people and written about them even from a basis of lack of knowledge, really, because I had never seen any Nagas, and then suddenly you were thrown into them. it was very lucky that I did that first tour with Mills, who could tell me so many things which otherwise would take a long time to find out. The great problem, of course, from the very beginning was language. I had tried to learn a little Assamese then at the School of Oriental Studies, which already existed while I was at LSE, but I had not been very successful there. And so when I came to Nagas, I had really no language which was very useful. But I was young still, and when one is young, one picks up languages relatively easy. So I engaged a young Naga who had some English. And within about a few months, I managed to speak that kind of lingua franca, which is a kind of pidgin Assamese, which is now still the only language in which the various Naga tribes can communicate with each other, because they all have different languages, mutually not understandable Tibeto-Burman languages. So I managed among the Nagas to acquire enough of that language so that after 4 or 5 months, I didn't need very much any translator except for particularly difficult subjects. But the experience to be in the field, of course, was extremely pleasant. And also, I had the great fortune being with Mills, who had all the sort of arrangements. I mean, I didn't have the difficulty of finding out how does one get food and how does one get somebody to cook it for you and all these things, because I was at once introduced into the kind of style of life of district officers. And district officers then were very difficult from what they are now, because they walked on foot. I mean, there were no motor roads, and they walked on foot, or sometimes they might have used the pony. Now, of course, Indian district officers have jeeps, and so they rush from their headquarters to some villages, arrive, talk for an hour or two to the villages, and in a cloud of dust they disappear again. So they haven't that close contact with the old colonial British officers had. And that actually, I think, makes a great difference to the whole administration as it was and as it is now.
Can I ask you again about the language? You learnt, as you say, pidgin Assamese. Did the other district officers, did Hodgson and Mills speak Naga?
They spoke absolutely fluent. This, what is now called Nagamese, namely it is an Assamese adapted to Nagas. They learned also some of the dialects of the Nagas, and I think Hutton, for instance, I think was quite fluent in one of them. But on the whole, as the Nagas talked to each other in that pidgin Assamese, it was for a district officer who in any case had to deal with different tribes, I think adequate to have this lingua franca.
You yourself decided to work with one specific group of Nagas. Which one did you choose, and why did you choose that one?
These were the Konyak Nagas. They seemed to be the most interesting because they had not been under British administration for very long. Only a small group of villages were under administration at that time, and those were the ones where I could go. They were virtually unknown. Very little had been written about them. There was one Turdari by Hutton. He had once visited some Konyak villages. Otherwise, nothing was known. The main large tribes, such as Angami Nagas and Sema Nagas, Ao Nagas, they had all been described in a series of monographs, which are still classics nowadays, mainly by Hutton and Mills. So I didn't want to go to a tribe which had already been studied. So I chose the Conyaks. I was very lucky because they were extremely interesting and they were also very attractive people.
So you arrived to do your fieldwork among the Konyak Nagas. One of the first sites you saw were the megalithic monuments which stood in the Naga villages. Did this interest you?
It interested me, yes, because I had in Vienna, under the influence actually of Heine Gelden, who was very interested in megalithic cultures altogether, I had then taken an interest in the distribution of megalithic civilizations throughout Southeast Asia. But I must say, I had also been by that time in Malinowski's seminar, and so I had slightly changed my view in the sense that I realized that when you go first to any tribe for the first time, any population indeed, you have to try first to get the social system straight. And megalith, I think, from that point of view, would have been almost sort of a thrill, where I would not particularly take a very great interest. Quite apart from the fact that among the Konyak Nagas, the erection of megalithic monuments are not as important as among, for instance, among the Angamis, where they have great feasts of merit, and the Konyaks don't they? Konyaks really only put up stone monuments when they had brought in some head. They were headhunters, as all Nagas. But by the time I came there, the Konyaks, let's say, didn't hunt heads anymore of those villages where I was. Later on, I had a good deal of experience of seeing heads on trees among other Nagas.
I was going to ask you about that. But could I ask you about another institution which you came across? And I'm interested in your reference to Malinowski and his well-known interest in sexual behavior of savages, because one of the institutions you came across were the men's houses, or morungs as they were called, which you described as an institution much like the English public school. I was wondering if you could describe what a morung was and how it worked.
Well, a morung is a men's house or bachelor's hall, which is a kind of ritual center of a village. It is also a place where the unmarried young men, boys and young men, sleep, where some married men spend a good deal of their time, which is the center for village rituals and festivals. You refer to Malinowski's interest in sexual behavior. In the morungs, there was no sexual behavior of any kind, because that was banned to girls, to women altogether. But there were also girls' dormitories. And while the young men and boys went to the morung, the girls went to the girls' dormitories, and the young men could visit the girls in their dormitories. Indeed, the girls' dormitories were put up and constructed by those young men who were potential mates for the girls. So it's quite true that this is, in Naga culture, it's quite an important feature, the men's houses and those girls' dormitories. And of course, men's houses are very widespread among different tribes, not only among other Naga tribes. There is that well-known book, The Murya and the Gotul, by Verja Elvin. And he described the youth dormitories of the Murya-Gons in Basta. There are other Indian tribes too, like the Oraons or the Gadabars, the Bondos, who all have either men's houses or youth dormitories. So it is quite an important institution.
Yes, and you also found it, I believe, in Nepal, among the Gurungs, for example.
Among the Gurungs you have the Rodigar, which is, however, very different from the Naga men's. The Naga men's houses are also very important because they are the places where most of the wood carvings and sculptures, wooden sculptures are, because they are highly decorated and painted. So the men's house is really a center both for ritual activities and also artistic activities, because the other houses are not decorated. But in the men's houses there are figures of men and women and of elephants and tigers, and that was very sad when I returned to the Konyak Nagas 34 years later in 71. I found that most of the men's houses didn't exist anymore. Modernization had really done away with that.
Did you manage to take photographs of these carvings?
Yes, I did, and in my first book then about the Konyaks, which was not a proper anthropological monograph, but almost like a travel book, called The Naked Nagas. In that there are quite a number of photographs. I also actually collected some of the smaller sculptures, not taking them out of the men's houses, which I think would have been quite wrong even if one could have done that. But I got the same artist to carve for me. Some of them are in the Museum of Anthropology, Völkerkunde Museum in Vienna. A few, I think, are in Cambridge. So I did do some collecting. Later on, I must say, I found that to collect sufficiently to bring back museum collections takes too much time, and in the future I did not really collect very much.
But on this first expedition you collected?
On that first expedition I collected quite a lot.
What objects apart from the...
Well, carvings, textiles, they are easy to collect and easy to transport, all sorts of small domestic implements, pots and pans, and grass skirts, and spears, and those
drums.
Small drums, and a few things which I had again. They have, for instance, those gongs, the Nagas, with a slit. So they are really xylophones. The proper term is a xylophone. And so I had one or two made miniature xylophones, but the big ones one would need a huge airplane to bring them back.
The main collection that you made is in Austria, is it?
The main, correct, because then I was based on Vienna still, and I had got some money from the Museum for Völkerkunde, so there's quite a substantial Naga collection in Vienna in the Ethnographic Museum.
But also some of your collections here in Cambridge?
Yes, there are a few pieces in Cambridge, and there are very few pieces in the Horniman Museum in London.
You said that when you went back, the Morums were falling into decay. You talk in your book on Return to the Naked Nagas about the influence of the Baptist missions in the Naga Hills. I was wondering whether they were behind some of this change in attitude.
They largely were. The Konyak Nagas, as I knew them in 1936 or 37, had not been under any mission influence. And the interesting thing is that after the departure of the British officials and after the departure of the American Baptist missionaries, there were Nagas who then spread Christianity among tribes which had been untouched before. And the Konyak Nagas were one of those types. And I remember in the village called Wok Ching, where I had spent most of the time when I was first working there, the people told me, well, you know, since Christianity came in, we have given up many of our old rituals and festivities. But we aren't really Christians either, so now we are nothing. I mean, we have lost our old religion and we haven't adopted a new one.
It seems on the surface strange that a society which you describe as so happy, gay, cheerful, drinking their own form of alcohol, engaging in a very free and open sexual relationships and social relationships, should with such zeal take to a very ascetic form of Christianity. Do you have any ideas why they should have done this?
Well, actually, I must say they didn't. Namely, outwardly, they became Christians, and I think the main reason was at that time, by for instance the Cognacs, that Christianity was linked in their minds with education. There had been mission schools, the other tribes had literature, etc. Then these Naga missionaries, they came in and said, look, I mean, if you want to survive in the modern world, and in the world of modern Indian politics, you must become literate. And now we will bring literacy. And it's quite true that in all Nagas who are present in any government positions, they are all the products of mission schools. So those Nagas, those Cognacs who told me now we are nothing, we aren't Christians and we aren't the old, haven't got our old religion, they are those who certainly didn't take up Christianity with any particular conviction. See, they certainly didn't give up drinking rice beer, and I very much doubt whether their sexual morals have changed very much.
On their sexual morals, though one shouldn't go into it too much, one of the very striking features which must have struck you was the difference between the Western European Christian attitude towards premarital intercourse and the attitudes in this society. What was the main difference between their attitude and...
Well, the main difference was that among the Cognac Nagas, it was taken for granted that all the young boys and girls would have love affairs, and nobody objected to that. And then later on, after they had some period of premarital enjoyment, then they would marry. And on the whole, and that is not, I found, not only among Cognac Nagas, this is the same, for instance, among the Bastard Gond, described by Varya Elvin in this book on the youth dormitories, that where there is great freedom in before marriage among the young people, the marriages then are relatively stable. But I found that other Gonds, whom I had studied, we might come to that later on, where there is not very much premarital permissiveness. There the marriages are by no means stable, and their sort of flexibility comes in later, that people have a succession of marriages. So certainly one can't generalize, because in modern Western societies there is premarital permissiveness, but not necessarily marital stability. So you might have it both ways too.
During your fieldwork, you suddenly received a message that J.P. Mills was going to go on a punitive expedition into an area to the Patcoy Hills. Could you perhaps tell us something about that mission?
Well, that was a great piece of luck for any anthropologist, I think. That I was allowed to to accompany a district officer who was going on an expedition into areas where neither he nor any other British officer, not to talk of anthropologists, had ever been. It was a kind of punitive expedition, but not entirely. It was really an expedition into the unadministered tribal areas which lay between the administered Naga Hills district and the frontier of Burma, where headhunting was going on. And everybody knew that, and there was no intention to administer that area. But if people from that area raided into the administered parts of Naga Hills, then expeditions were undertaken. And in this particular case, there had been some raids on villages which were, although not administered, but they were somewhat friendly with the British administered Nagas. And some people had not only, many had been killed, but others had been captured and taken across the Burma border, because the Nagas on the other side of the borders were known to use also captives in war as for human sacrifice. Human sacrifice is a sort of alternative for headhunting. And the idea of Mills was to free some of those captives. He also succeeded, and he freed a few. Some of them were children. So the whole expedition had really the purpose of to establish that if they exceeded their sort of permitted limit of headhunting and made great raids on villages and killed just too many people and captured others, that the British government would take some steps. And that was quite successful, but it was marvelous for me, because for the first time I got into areas which had never been administered, which had never been even looked at, which were white spots on the map. And that is a sort of what an anthropologist really would like to do, to see a society which had not been influenced by outside administration at all.
This was an extremely dangerous mission. You went with 2.5 platoons of Assam rifles and 360 coolies, and you travelled off into the forest, which was filled with sharp pointed sticks to trap you, and with the possibility of people firing poisoned crossbow arrows at you. You must have been slightly apprehensive as you set off.
Well, I was a little apprehensive, but not very apprehensive, I must say. And I must say it was not quite as dangerous that later on the, what is now Untitled Pradesh in then called Northeast Frontier Agency, I think I did trips which are a bit more dangerous than that. But because there, after all, we had at least some Assam rifle, that is this kind of police force recruited from Gurkhas, Nepalese Gurkhas. But we were actually attacked by several hundred of Nagas, and we had to run away. We ran a little faster than the Nagas, not because we could inherently run faster, but because our Assam rifle escort then managed to fire into the group of Nagas which were running after us, and that put them off. No, it was a little dangerous.
Because at one point you were running up a hill with 500 Nagas behind you.
Yes, that was that
50
occasion.
guns in front of you firing at the Nagas.
Yes, that was the occasion.
And they shot 5 of the Nagas, is that right?
They did. If they hadn't shot those 5 who were sort of in the front rank, I think you wouldn't be talking to me now, because I think they certainly, we were outnumbered to such an extent, probably 20-1, that we wouldn't have had any other chance.
So we're talking to you now, but what was the final result of the expedition? Did they destroy the villages, or?
The expedition was that those 2 villages which had refused to give up any of those captives and had taken the captives away with them, they were set on fire. Of course, that sounds worse than it is, because these houses are built of bamboo and thatch and so on. They can very easily be rebuilt. It's not like burning a village with solid houses. And in order to get them to see that government is really serious about pursuing their aim of getting these captives back. And we got them back. I mean, Mills got them back. So they were freed.
And from the poles in the village, you took off a basket full of heads, which no one would be prepared to carry, and therefore you had to carry them back yourself.
Yes, they had hung up in good Naga fashion the heads of their enemies, and they were not, fortunately, not absolutely fresh heads. I mean, they had still hair and skin on, but the hair and skin was dried and so on. And as I was then collecting for a museum, I wanted to have those head trophies, and I found a basket in one of the deserted houses, put them in. But then none of the Nagas who had come with us wanted to carry that basket, because they said, well, we carry heads which we have taken and so on, but we don't really know what the ritual position of those heads is, and it might be quite dangerous for us, so I had to carry those heads myself. Sorry.
As anthropological specimens, you decided, instead of taking them to the museum, to distribute them to the awaiting Nagas, and you witnessed what I think, as you described, must be an absolutely unique thing for an anthropologist ever to have seen, which are the head-hunting ceremonies. Could you just very briefly describe?
Well, the Konyak Nagas, among whom I had been living for, by that time, about 7 months before I got on that trip, they were very excited, because they knew I was going with an armed force in an area where there were headhunters, there would be fighting, and they expected, of course, that we would possibly get some heads. They thought of heads which we would cut off, which we hadn't done. But when I brought back these dried heads, they had all been looking forward to fresh heads. They thought, well, dried heads are better than no heads, and they thought it would be possible to perform the ceremonies which are normally performed if a head is brought into a village by a member of that village. Now, I had lived long enough there, so they thought I could, for ritual purposes, be considered as being a member of the community and having brought those heads. And then they didn't ask very much how I got them, or whether I had actually killed the people or not. Heads were heads. So then the question is now, there were altogether, I think, 6 or 7 heads. Now, who would get those heads? Now, fortunately, it is not necessary for a ceremony to be performed to have a whole head. You can do it with parts. And also that because in the same way as if a real head is brought in, sometimes it is split up, and everybody who participated in the raid will have one part. And they were so keen on having these, performing these rites and having the head, because only those young men who had participated in the ritual of bringing in heads, enemy heads, were entitled to wear certain ornaments and also to have their face tattoo, which is necessary for a headhunter. And as they had lived under the Pax Britannica for several years already, they had not had a chance of taking heads themselves. So these substitute heads were very useful. So actually the ritual was done exactly as if they themselves had brought in enemy heads. And I could both photograph it, I could record it, I could record the various songs and whatever was being said, recorded. Fortunately, in those days there were no, it was in 1936, there were no tape recorders, so I had to write down there what they said. And rather amusingly, when 34 years later I went there again, and I saw some men who had face tattoos, middle-aged men. And I said, how did I think there's no more head hunting you have to do? They said, these are your heads. But actually, I think even now, I think the last recorded, confirmed type of head hunting, I think happened in something like 62 or 63, 1962, on the Assam-Burma border. And I think on the Burma side, where there is virtually no administration, I think headhunting probably still goes on.
What is the, very, very briefly, what is the function, so to speak, of headhunting? What do they see the virtue of headhunting?
Oh, the virtue is that they believe there are certain kind of magical forces in the human head. And the person who takes that head, brings it home to his village, this kind of magical virtue that is transferred to his village, and therefore the heads are put on shelves in the men's houses again, or chief's house, and they are kept there. And several times a year they are being fed with rice and rice beer, because in order to keep this magical force alive. So the idea is really that it is useful for the fertility of the village, the fertility of men and women and of cattle and of the fields, to have these heads. And that's the same, for the same reason, of course, human sacrifice has been performed. Among Nagas, human sacrifice was really a substitute for headhunting. Namely, it was, if you bought a slave and killed him, you could get all the prestige of a headhunter without risking your own life. But even now, you will always read about human sacrifice in the Indian press, because even now there are cases. I was recently in India and I saw one or two small reports of somebody being arrested because of having killed somebody in a Shiva temple or so on, because human sacrifice has certain advantages for getting, for instance, when a new tank is being built or a new bridge is being built, a kind of foundation sacrifice, and that has not completely disappeared from India now.
Well, perhaps we ought to move on, since we've talked a good deal. There's a great deal more about the Nagas, obviously, and your return to the Nagas, but fortunately some of this has been written up in your books. You went then from the Naga hills to go and work in central India, but at a later point you returned to Assam, but not to the Nagas. Why did you return, and where did you return?
Well, that was really, again, lucky coincidence. I had, after doing my first 13 months of field work among the Nagas, I had come back to Austria. But I had felt that my work among the Nagas had not been completed. I wanted to have another period. So as soon as possible after this, I set out for India again with the intention of going to the Naga Hills. Actually, a fortnight after I arrived in India, the war broke out. So neither could I go to the Naga Hills, nor was it really possible to go what I didn't really want particularly, to go back to Vienna. Because by that time another raid had taken place, namely Hitler had occupied Austria, and consequently Austria was then part of Germany. I had by that time a German passport. And so when the war broke out in India, I was in the position of an enemy alien. But fortunately I had good connections, and so I was allowed to do anthropological work in the place where where I was when the war broke out, which was Hyderabad state. And I've then worked for quite a number of years in Hyderabad. In the fourth year of my stay there, I had then an offer from the government of India through my old friend Philip Mills, who by that time was no longer Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills, but was advisor to the governor of Assam. And this message from him offered me a post under the government of India as special officer and assistant political officer on the northeast frontier, which was then called NIFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, to do some exploration among the virtually unknown tribes which live in the mountains between Assam and Tibet. They had never been administered all through the British rule because there was no apparently need or advantage. But in the course of the war, when the Japanese occupied parts of Burma, it was felt that anything might happen in these northeastern mountains too, and therefore it would be advisable to at least find out what conditions were there. So 2 or 3 expeditions were sent into these areas, and in one section I was chosen to go in and do some, from the point of view of the government of India, just exploratory work, from my own point of view, connected with that anthropological work. And I had there the great advantage of going into an area which was inhabited by several different tribes. The most interesting perhaps were the Apatanis. There were about 15,000 people living in one single valley, very densely populated, surrounded by quite different tribes, and to study a society which had never been administered by any outside power. And therefore, everything was as it had been probably for centuries. So I spent then, it was in 1944 and 45, until the end of the war, when that whole project was called off. I spent among Apatanis and then also neighboring tribes, and therefore I had said before that perhaps trips there were somewhat more dangerous than among the Nagas, because they were very warlike tribes, and if you were friendly with one and went to the other, you could possibly be attacked. It actually didn't happen. And so I worked there, and also later on wrote some books about the Apatanis. And I tried in recent years to revisit all the various people I had met before. And it was particularly interesting among the Apatanis because they, in the meanwhile, had been administered by the Indian administration and had developed extraordinarily fast. They had schools, and consequently there were educated Apatanis. This was, again, I was there last in 1982, which was after all from 44, was I mean nearly 40 years later. And I could see there the whole change which had taken place in a previously untouched society. But whereas in other parts of India, a change usually meant a kind of deprivation, namely that people lost their land to more advanced people, and their general standard of living and so deteriorated. It was not so among the Apatanis. They had greatly improved, if you may say so. The area had not been overrun by outsiders, and the Apatanis had sort of accomplished the transition to modernity and modern politics and all that very rapidly and very successfully. There are now Apatanis, members of the Legislative Assembly, and other politicians, and many have university degrees and are members of government services, etc. So that was very interesting, this to see them in their original state and see them a long time afterwards.
Yes, we'll go on to talk about the problems of tribal people being in their contacts with the major civilization. I wanted to just go back though to your first arrival among the Apatanis. You said that this was more dangerous in many ways than the trip to the Nagas, but it seems to have been a partly self-imposed danger in that, against the advice of almost everyone, you set off unarmed without any escort, armed escort, because the government wanted you to take masses of Gurkhas with you. Also with your wife Betty, who before in your previous fieldwork you hadn't been married, you're now married. So you took a white woman and yourself unarmed into these hills. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I decided to do that very much against great opposition on the part of the government of India, because they said nobody ever went into those hills unarmed. And we don't take any responsibility. If you want to take your wife with you, you must sign that it's on your own responsibility, etc. But I thought, if I go into an area which had no contact with the outside world, and I arrive with an escort of Gurkha soldiers, there is just no chance of establishing any kind of friendly relations. So you have to take a little risk and to go in alone, unarmed, and also to it's a great advantage to have your wife with you, because they think that people who go with their wife, they are probably have no hostile intentions, and they don't go there in order to make war on anybody, I mean, even if they have no arms. Apart from that, by that time, that was in 1944, we had about done field work in other parts of India, in Hyderabad state, together for a long time, so we didn't want to give up. And so it was for personal reasons as well as for reasons of really diplomacy, because that was made it possible to go to people who were quite, one might say, quite wild, in the sense that they had a lot of feuds among themselves without getting very much involved.
You went to two areas where the people were, as you say, thought of by the plainsmen as extremely wild and ferocious, and yet in your books you describe them with great affection and warmth. How physically and mentally did you find the hill tribesmen of the Assam area?
Well, those people who were known as so ferocious, the people then known as dufflers, now they call themselves nishis, they were friendly to us, and they can be very charming to their friends, but they also can be very fierce to their enemies. And actually, they were probably the most, how shall I say, martial or most ferocious people I have been working with it. I mean, I think everybody, every adult man had been involved in raids, and many of them had themselves been captured and then held to ransom. So it was a society, a bit like the Pathans on the northwest frontier, who were continuous in a kind of process of feuds, revenge killings, and then periods of peace, and again a raid or feud. And that seemed to me so interesting, to study a society where there didn't seem to be any kind of local authority. I mean, there were no headmen, there was no village council. Everybody was really a law to himself, and also who had to look after himself. I mean, if somebody had a grievance, there was nobody he could appeal. There were no legal sanctions. I mean, if you killed somebody, that man had no redress except that, the family had no redress, that his brothers or sons and so might then kill someone of your side. So this was really the possibility of seeing how does a society with apparently no authority system can really function. Well, it does function.
In this, they were very different in their temperament from the Apatanis.
Yes, they were very different, because the Apatanis, they lived in a very complex area. They had large villages up to 800, 1,000 houses. So they couldn't have that society couldn't have worked without some kind of local system of authority and administration. While the nishis, they lived in dispersed settlements, so it was not so essential to have a very close control over people's actions. Although the Patanis were wet rice cultivators, they had a complicated system of irrigation, and that too needed some cooperation, control, etc.
Though they had a complex economy, as you said, they were technologically a very simple society, in that they were really pre-wheel and largely pre-plough cultivators when you first went, weren't they?
I think the Apatanis must have been, until 30 years ago, very much comparable to a Neolithic civilization. Namely, they had a fairly developed agriculture, irrigation and careful control of their resources. They had not only rice fields, but groves of fruit trees and pine trees, etc.
The Apatanis had a very sophisticated economy, but they lacked a number of features of more developed economies. What features did they lack?
Well, they didn't have the principle of animal traction, for instance. Although they have cattle, the cattle was neither used for plowing nor for carrying. So their economy was really a very sort of, in a way, Neolithic, also they were not Stone Age because they had metal.
Did they use wheels?
They did not use wheels. I think the first wheel they saw was on the first Indian aeroplane when the Indian army made an airstrip there. They had no wheels.
You worked among the Apatanis, but quite soon after you'd visited there with your wife. Another white lady visited them, namely Ursula Graham Bauer. Did you meet her?
I had met her before, but actually her husband was then appointed there as political officer. That was not immediately after I had finished there. There was a kind of period in between when the Apatanis again were left to their own devices. Then already after independence, the Indians established there a much more complicated administration. Now, Ursula Graham Bauer, who had worked independently in the Naga Hills, she then came to the Apatanis and also then wrote a book on them called The Hidden Land. And her husband was a political officer. So a certain amount of anthropological material was provided by her.
The people you worked among, the Apatanis and also among the Nagas, were they physically an attractive people?
The Nagas were very attractive, particularly the Konyak Nagas. They were really quite beautiful people, also with wonderful figures. Girls were very attractive. They are Mongolid, but rather sort of like Malays or Indonesians. And very, very good looking, really. The Apatanis were also Mongolid. They were perhaps not quite as attractive as Konyak Naga, but still I would say on the whole they were attractive people. They looked attractive.
And what about the place itself, the physical landscape?
The Naga Hills are absolutely beautiful, the landscape. They are not very high. I mean, the villages are lying at altitudes between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, and sort of beautiful rolling hills, and with that pattern of shifting cultivation. I mean, forests here and there, golden rice fields, very, very attractive. The Apatani Valley as such is also a beautiful place. It's set in between wooded hills. The valley bottom is about nearly 5,000 feet high. The hills left and right are about 6,000-7,000. And apart from the area which is under rice and which accordingly is sometimes pale green and sometimes also golden and so on, they have quite a lot of orchards, and in the spring it is absolutely beautiful when all these fruit trees are in blossom. So the whole area is extremely attractive. On clear days you see the Himalayan peaks at the back.
Well, later we'd like to return to the question of how the Apatani economy changed. But I wondered if we could now turn from Assam and the Northeast Frontier Agency to the other area where you did a lot of work, chronologically going backwards. You first went to work in Hyderabad among some very simple people, hunter-gatherer peoples, called the Chenchus. What made you study them and what were they like?
Well, the whole position in Hyderabad was, I mentioned before, that I was sort of caught there by the outbreak of the war and allowed by the Hyderabad government. Hyderabad was then under the Nizam of Hyderabad, to work among the tribal populations, and it was a fairly obvious choice. There was one tribe not well known, not well described, known as Chenchus. They were one of the few tribes of hunters and food gatherers left still in peninsular India. So it was reasonable to start among them. It was a great contrast to the highly advanced Nagas, which had huge villages and very beautiful people. Chenchus are rather, one would say, rather unattractive and very dark-skinned and have nothing of all the beautiful clothes, for instance, which the Nagas have. So it was a disappointment for my wife. She had always seen these lovely photographs of the Nagas, and it was her first time that she went, accompanied me on fieldwork. And there were these very poor Chenchus who lived under windscreens or little huts, and had really very not much which was visibly attractive, but they were very interesting because they were one of the few tribes who still lived on collecting, food collecting, digging up roots in the forest and some forest fruits, etc. Hunting, there wasn't much hunting left because their territory is quite small and people had come from outside with guns, etc. They had more or less wiped out all bigger game. So they just managed to survive as they were. But their type of the lifestyle was still probably as in India, hunters and food gatherers were over centuries, if not thousands of years. I mean, we know that in South India there were Paleolithic cultures, and those makers of these Paleolithic scrapers and hand axes and so on, they must have lived on the same kind of forest produce as the Chenchus did. So from that point of view it was interesting.
What was most striking about the Chenchus? Is there anything that you found most extraordinary about their way of life?
Well, I think probably again that was the striking thing was they too, as I mentioned before, some people in northeast India, that they had no kind of judicial system, no authority system, but they seemed to manage to live peacefully without conflicts, and but largely because I think the communities were so small, the areas of conflict were so few, because nobody had any property and everybody went out in the morning and collected roots and fruits from the forest. So there was not much reason for any kind of conflict. Apart from that, if two people in a group didn't get on, then one probably moved to another group, because nobody had any property in land. So there was a great mobility. I mean, if you saw a settlement, let's say, of 8 or 9 huts at one time, and you came perhaps 2 months later there, you found that 3 or 4 families may have moved from there, settled somewhere else, because they were never settled for very long in one place. So that was interesting, this great flexibility.
Moving from that very simplest of social organizations, they're very complex as well, to your next piece of fieldwork in Hyderabad. You worked among the Reddys of the Bison Hills. What sort of society was that, and why did you study them?
Well, I went there again because nobody had studied them. The whole area, which was in the Eastern Ghats, about where the Godavari River breaks through the Eastern Ghats. There are some forested hills, and in these people lived who were shifting cultivators. Rather, the Konyak Nagas were shifting cultivators too, but much more advanced with large settlements, etc. The Reddys lived in small settlements, again, great mobility. They lived for 2 or 3 years in one place, and then they shifted their fields and very often also their huts. So they were really, in a way, the next stage after the Changes. And the Changes were only food gatherers and hunters. The Reddys were also still lived a good deal on what they gathered in the forest, but in addition to that, they also had slash and burn cultivation and grew millets and pulses and not rice because it's too dry there and they had no wet fields. But perhaps they lived on the grain which they reaped could live for about 5-6 months. The rest of the time they had to look for food in the forest. So they were really in a stage of transition between food gatherings and cultivation. Also, they had already begun to have some income from forest labor. They were used by forest contractors to cut bamboos. In that way, they were very often rather badly cheated because they didn't know really how many bamboos they had cut, and they were only paid after perhaps after some weeks, and they were told, well, you delivered so many hundred bamboos, and it was kind of piecework. So they were not very well treated by the outside world, but somehow they subsisted on a bit of wage labor, a bit of slash and burn cultivation, and still some hunting and gathering in the forest.
What sort of settlements did they live in? Were they scattered like?
Well, they lived partly in settlements in the forest where there were perhaps 4, 5, 6 houses in a forest clearing. Some had moved, that was in the hills, some had moved down to near the banks of the river, and there they had there were villages of perhaps 15, 20, 25 houses, and there they had begun some permanent cultivation. There was some flat land, and they had begun there to use plows and cultivate sorghum and other crops. The tragic point in that was they had been sort of advanced to permanent cultivation, but in more recent years then they nearly lost all that permanent land because outsiders from mainly the coastal areas came in, non-tribals, Telugu-speaking people, and so they already lost most of that land again.
We then moved on, having done enough field work for most anthropologists for their lifetime, but you then went on to work among an even more economically settled population, the Gonds, but they were still slash and burn.
No, the Gonds were already proper plough cultivators. There are different types of Gonds. Some, but those I mainly worked in, which were also in Hyderabad state, in a district known as Adilabad district. they also lived in forest areas, but they all had permanent land and cultivated with plows and bullocks, and were much more settled than the Reddies. Of course, the Gonds have an old history. There were Gond Rajas, and even in the Middle Ages, Gond states, and they were really in many ways on a level with Hindu population, perhaps economically. So it was quite a different scenario. And also the Gonds were very numerous. There were, alone in Hyderabad, there were nearly 100,000 Gonds. Altogether in India, there are nearly 4 million Gonds. And they are divided into different tribes. For instance, Gonds were also studied by Verja Elvin. I mentioned before his book on the youth dormitories, the Murya Gonds in Basta, which is adjoining to Hyderabad. But each of these tribes has its peculiar system, and these so-called Raj Gonds I studied, they were very different from the Basta Gonds, and in a sense economically more advanced. But they were then also under threat, namely their land was quite attractive with rich soils, particularly suitable for growing cotton, black cotton soil. And so there had already begun a process by which Gond land was alienated by more advanced people who came from the plains. The Gonds in the highlands of Hyderabad, they were in the hills, I mean not mountains, but sort of on plateaus, and areas a bit different from the big river valleys like the Godavari Valley, and people from there then were infiltrating into the highlands, and the process had begun where the Gonds, some of the Gonds, lost their land.
You describe in your book on the Gonds, because this was a society you worked in perhaps almost longer than any other society, nearly 3 years in their villages you spent. You describe a sort of contradiction between a society which has a very free association of equal peoples combined with a sort of feudal system. I wondered how this society worked.
Well, the feudal system was a kind of remnant from the days of the great Gond Rajas. There was a kind of hereditary aristocracy. At the time when I came to that area, they really had held no more political power, because that was taken over by the administration of the Nizam's government. But the descendants of the former Rajas, they had still some status and not material privileges, but they were still highly respected. They in the sense that their probably word counted more than that of other people. If there were drawn out disputes, then very often they were referred, then fine people went to one of the Gond Rajas and asked him to meditate. But basically it was an egalitarian society, so that we find that in the villages there were really no status difference, except for these few members of Gond Rajas.
Was this a beautiful area that you were working in? I mean, physically?
Not as beautiful as the Naga Hills, but quite attractive. I mean, at that time there was still a lot of forest, so the villages were enclaves in the forests, and it was, I would say, it was an attractive area without having beautiful scenery.
And what are the people? Are the same? The Gonds?
The Gonds are, one can't say that they are very handsome, but they are quite attractive people. They are not spectacularly dressed or undressed like the Nagas. They were more or less like Indian villagers in dhotis and saris. But they are very pleasant people, and I was quite enjoying my stay there. But at that time there were already endless problems over questions of land and exploitation.
After your purely anthropological research among the Chenshus, Gonds and Reddys, I understand that you were employed by the Hyderabad government in an administrative capacity. I wondered if you could say what you did in that work.
Well, the Hyderabad government, Nizam's government at that time, Hyderabad, as you know, was the largest of the Indian princely states, was aware by that time that there were problems in the tribal areas. And as I had worked among the tribes by that time for about 4 years, and also had been employed by the government of India on the northeast frontier, they decided to offer me a position as advisor for tribes and backward classes, as the position was called. But actually it was an administrative position where I had not only to advise, but I was then head of a department, kind of tribal welfare department, now it is called like that, and dealing with all the problems which are faced by the tribes. And the main problem was to secure them in the possession of their land. So I started among the Gonds with a sort of large scheme of land reform, that the Gonds were actually in possession, in occupation of land, but only few of them had any permanent rights. So the first step was to provide them all with rights to the land they had, and those who were not in occupation of land, to give them land. And at that time the idea was to provide every family with anything between 15 and 20 acres, which is quite adequate of dry land. That was, so to say, the essential foundation for any kind of improvement in their economic position, because the idea was that from then on nobody could acquire tribal land. Legislation was passed. Large areas, the major part of the districts inhabited by tribals were sort of made scheduled areas, as it's called in India, where only tribals could acquire land and no outsiders. And I held that position for 4 years. And at the end of this period, it seemed that the tribal problem from that point of view had really been solved. Of course, it wasn't known at that time that Hyderabad state would be incorporated into India, that the Nizam's administration would come to an end, and that quite a different kind of government would come in. Government which was not so interested in the affairs of the welfare of the tribals. And when I now go back to Hyderabad, which I do quite often, I find that much of the land which in my days was given to tribals, has again been alienated by an extraordinary influx of non-tribals from the neighboring areas, partly even from outside the state. From Maharashtra there's a great immigration, but that is part of that mobility in India, which also had recently, for instance, created all the trouble in Assam, where so many people from Bangladesh and Bengal entered Assam. And in Hyderabad too, Hyderabad of course is now only the town is called Hyderabad, the area is called Andhra Pradesh. There the tribals have suffered very badly from the influx of non-tribals, much more advanced, much more experience in dealing with the administration, so that actually the situation, the economic and political situation of the tribals is not particularly good now. But at the time of the Nizam's rule, I was able not only to carry out that system of land reform, but also to start schools for tribals, and schools in which they were first taught in their own language. Gondi is a Dravidian language, but it is quite different from Telugu and other Dravidian languages. So the idea was to have schools in which the children at first would be taught in their own language. There were of course no books, so the books had to be special readers, and primers had to be composed and printed. So that was again an attempt to kind of secure the Gond culture, which is quite a complex. I mean, Gonds have a large fund of myths and legends, etc., but they had no script and they had no literature. So that was an attempt to create a kind of Gond literature. Unfortunately, again, the changed political situation has really more or less wiped out those advances. Now there are no more Gondi school books used, but the tribals have to have the same kind of education anybody else has. So this again was an attempt made which didn't lead to very much. It would have led if there had not been very great political changes, but the anthropologists can't know that. But I think to go to that, I think inherently, I think it is a very important function of anthropologists who have spent perhaps 3 or 4 years to learn about a group of tribal people, that then they should become able, I mean, to put into a position where they can do something concrete for the tribal. Of course, nowadays it's not very likely that many Western anthropologists can do. I mean, Indians could do that, because with the end of the colonial period, there are not many parts of the world where anthropologists actually are entrusted with the administration of tribal people.
Could I ask, on the administrative side, I know that you admire greatly the philosophical and theoretical system put forward by a man who combined anthropology and administration, Verya Elwin. You knew Elwin, and you seem to have worked in many of the same societies as Elwin. Could you say something about him?
Well, Elwin was a very wonderful person. He was, he came to India as a missionary. Then he found out that and worked first among Gonds of the central provinces, which is now Madhya Pradesh. And he found that Gonds really don't need a new religion. What they want is help in practical matters. And he really did set up some sort of welfare centers first, entirely privately with some funds which he collected. And later on, however, he was employed by the government of India, again as advisor in the Northeast Frontier Agency. In between, however, he had done a lot of anthropological work in areas such as Basta and written books like the Muria and the Gotul and Maria Murder and Suicide, etc. He was perhaps the greatest sort of anthropological idealist I had ever met. He was a very well-educated person with a very sort of wide and broad outlook on life, and he was absolutely fascinated by tribal people, and he collected, for instance, a great deal of their myths and epics, etc. He also married twice tribal girls, one Gond girl and one other later on. And then finally he lived in his last years, he lived in Assam, in Shillong. He died relatively early, but not before he had really made a very great contribution, not only to anthropological literature, also in sort of inspiring people. For instance, he was had close contact with the Prime Minister Nehru, Pandit Nehru. And I think much of what had been done in the northeast frontier is due to the influence of Barry Elwin, who said that we must protect tribal people. We must not think that they must be totally assimilated to the culture of the advanced sections of the population. So he had, I think he exerted a very healthy influence on the thinking of that generation of Indians, like Nehru. Again, much of that has disappeared, but not completely, because in the northeast frontier, what is now called, was called NIFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, now called Arunachal Pradesh, in that territory, really, the situation of the tribals is far better than anywhere else. Because there is the so-called inner line policy, namely a policy that there is a line drawn between the tribal areas and the other parts of the country, in this case between Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, and whereas the tribals can move across that line, I mean, come out and go in again, outsiders, also Indians, are not allowed to cross that line without special permission from government. The idea is to avoid what has happened, for instance, in Andhra Pradesh, that so much tribal land falls into the hands of outsiders. That has not happened in Arunachal Pradesh. The Apatanis, for instance, they might have been overrun by people because they have quite fertile rice land, etc. If that hadn't happened, if they had not been protected. Also, the Apatanis, when they then, after my first experience with them, when they came in close contact with the Indian administration and with the people of Assam, because Apatanis could go to Assam, when they started to develop, for instance, some trade with the rest of India, with Assam, they were not at once, they didn't have to fight the competition of the ordinary trading castes like elsewhere, Banyas, and there were no money lenders in there. So they could really develop in a modern way, but they could develop on their own. And there also, the education which was then introduced was very successful, so that very many Apatanis got good education, first in their own area, and then young people, promising young people, were sent to various Indian universities. So you have now large number of Apatani graduates, and some in civil service, and Apatani doctors and veterinary surgeons, etc. Now, there's hardly any other area in India where tribals have been as successful. And they have been, I think, so successful because during the essential periods of development, they were protected from the competition with more advanced outsiders. So they could also become advanced, being more or less left on their own, but yet given them they were given the possibilities, for instance, for education, for development, etc.
Well, thank you very much for explaining that. At this point, you've done a lot of field work in two different areas, which is more than most anthropologists have done. But you then came back from your administrative post here to London to become Professor of Anthropology. What date did you become Professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies?
At what time?
Yes.
Well, I came back. I was offered a job at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 1949. When then I left, I resigned from my post in Hyderabad. I felt that really that was not a period when in India non-Indian could effectively work in quite a controversial position. Namely, to do tribal administration is always controversial because there are always the vested interests who try to acquire tribal land, who try to exploit the tribal. So I think an outsider here in the present setup in India could not effectively work. Apart from that, I thought also from the point of view of my anthropological career, that 10 years continuously in India, most of them spent in field work, were about enough, and it was time to go back to a university, also to catch up with everything which has happened for 10 years in anthropological thinking and theory. And so that position at the School of Oriental and African Studies seemed very attractive. And I was able, then gradually there in the department, the newly created Department of Anthropology, to build up a type of, interest in the areas in which I was interested, and also expand my own field, perhaps. School of Oriental and African Studies has a great advantage that they were very research-oriented, and that meant that it was not necessary to wait for a sabbatical. One could quite often go to the field. And so I was able, very soon after I had established this department, then not only to encourage my students and members of the staff, etc., to spend a good deal of time in fieldwork, but also myself to go. And once, that was in 1953, when I actually had gone back to Andhra Pradesh to see what had happened to the Gonds, etc. Then that was just the time when Nepal was opened for outsider. Nepal, which had always sort of interested me because I had worked a bit in the eastern Himalayas among Apatanis, Daflas, etc. But Nepal seemed a wonderful field for anthropology, but it had been closed at the time of the Rana rule, and only when the Rana rule came to an end was it possible for Westerners and Western anthropologists to work there.
So in 1953 you went into yet another virgin territory, so to speak, and spent a shortish time then, but revisited it in 1957 and at other times. Where did you go to work in Nepal?
Well, I started with the Sherpas of the, at that time, that particular area had become quite famous through the climbing of Mount Everest. And also one had heard about the Sherpas. And I thought now, after having been for so long in the tropical areas of South India, it would be very interesting as a contrast to go to an area of high altitude. Now the Sherpas, they live in valleys of an altitude, the villages of between 12 and 14,000 feet. And also I thought it would be very interesting to start in an area which was under Buddhist influence. I mean, not only, they were actually Buddhists, they were of Tibetan type of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. So I expected something totally different. And I think this is very important for anthropologists, not just to stick to one area, of course, of which you can get a complete expertise, admittedly, but the comparison of such people as different. On the one hand, the Chenchus and the Konyak Nagas and the Abatanis and so on. And then in Nepal I found the Sherpas, who were, of course, compared to people like Gonds, and so highly civilized people. I mean, among the Sherpas, for instance, certainly more than 50% of the adults, particularly adult men, could read Tibetan because they needed that for their ritual performances in their Gompas, and then there were these interesting Buddhist monasteries. So there was something totally new. And so although I continued, and even now I usually spend some time of the year in the one or other area of my previous interest in India, actually since '53, certainly for about 10 years, I concentrated almost entirely on Nepal. And in the course of that, I walked really through the length and breadth of Nepal, and then found areas which seemed worthwhile of study, so that I could encourage students of mine to go to those areas and do a much more detailed study than I had been able. But I did manage not only to do some work on the Sherpas and write a book on the Sherpas, this kind of first book on any monograph on any people in Nepal.
What did you do then?
Well, actually, almost while I was working among the Reddys, I thought I should know something about their neighbors too. And then I did a trip into Orissa, in the hills, also Eastern Ghats, where there were two tribes which had never been really described at that time. One is called Bondo and the other is Gadabas. The interesting thing is they were quite different from anything I had seen in Hyderabad. And they reminded me in a way of the Konyak Nagas. Linguistically, they also don't really belong to the South. They don't speak Dravidian language, but they speak Austroasiatic languages. And these Bondos and Gadabas, they, in some ways, they have cultural similarity. I won't say connections, but certainly similarities to the people in the northeast. And I found I did not do a detailed study there, but they also, for instance, had a very developed megalithic culture. And they had, you mentioned before, use dormitories and similar institution, perhaps in a way, as the Nagas. So I found that that was only a sort of short interlude, but they were again something quite different from anything I had seen before. And of course, they gave me some comparative material rather than that I made a detailed study of them. I think we can cut it out.
So we'll cut here and move back to the
Sherpas, yes.
Could I ask you, before we go look at the Sherpas themselves, I noticed that you dedicated your book on the Sherpas to your wife, Elizabeth. And you mentioned her frequently. You said she helped gather the statistical data and she helped you in the medical work and so on. I wondered if you could say something about her part in your anthropological fieldwork.
As soon as we got, my wife and I went to India, we were always together in the field, and so she naturally took a very considerable interest in it. Indeed, I mean, there was nothing else to, if you are married to the anthropologist and you are sitting in a little village, you obviously either you go mad or you have to take an interest in the people you are living with. So it is very difficult to say really what the one or the other contributes. I mean, I did the more sort of professional part of it, but she also was made perhaps partly the public relations work. I mean, she always treated anybody who, I mean, people who were sick or had any problem and distributed medicine and so on. So I think it was quite an important cooperation in the field. And I think it is, I have the feeling that it's probably easier for two people who are not exactly doing the same. I think that couples both were professional anthropologists. It is more difficult to work together among the same people. While if one is an anthropologist and the other is looks at the people from a different, purely sort of human point of view, I think that works very well. Later on, my wife, of course, then, as you may know, went into anthropological bibliography and wrote all those bibliographical works on bibliography of South Asian anthropology.
You talk of, since we're talking about fieldwork, can I just ask you, many of the areas you went into were extremely remote and without any kinds of modern facilities. What did you find the most difficult aspect of fieldwork? You mentioned frequently, particularly among the Apatanis, the lack of privacy, the constant being watched and being surveyed. Even your most private ablutions and so on were watched. You could gauge the age of the watchers by the height of the small holes they bored in the wall to watch it from. Was that the most difficult thing about fieldwork, or?
Well, I think that is, if you come to a people like the Apatani, it were very many people living in one area, so it's a large population, and they had never seen any outsider, and you are surrounded virtually during daylight hours by large crowds all the time. I think this is difficult. One gets used to that too. The other difficulty is, I think, purely, what shall I say, purely physical hardship. For instance, the Chenchus. These people, they, in Hyderabad then, hunters and gatherers, so they don't produce anything which is very edible for you. Nevertheless, you have to move with them through the forest. You can't really carry much with you. So there one is, I mean, you live there in more or less in the open, because they have no houses, and where you can have a tent, but in the Indian summer, it's simply the climatic difficulties and so on. I mean, everything has its own advantages and disadvantages. I mean, Nepal has the enormous advantage that the scenery is so beautiful and there are houses to live in, etc. On the other hand, again, while you suffer from the heat in the Deccan, in South India, the cold can be very troublesome too if you are traveling. And I've just now been, about months ago, I was back among the Sherpas, and even in the houses it were very often sub-zero temperatures.
Well, we're back in Nepal, so perhaps I can ask you about Nepal, about the Sherpas further. What struck you most about living among the Sherpas? Were there any features of their society which surprised you most when you arrived there?
Let us say, which didn't surprise me very much because I expected it, but features I had not previously, for instance, encountered. I mean, I had definitely no personal contact. For instance, one was their marriage system, polyandry. I mean, and I was surprised to see that polyandry, which means one woman has 2 or 3 husbands, that seemed to work so much better than polygyny. Namely, one man having 2 or 3 wives doesn't seem to run as smoothly as one woman having 2 or 3 husbands. Now, these are sort of little experiences one has, in the sense that you find something which you don't expect.
Could you, since many people are interested in polyandry, and it is a special feature of that area, could you explain why you think the system works so well and why it's there at all? Is there any rationale to it?
I think it works well. Perhaps one may say that on the whole it may be that men are a little less jealous than women are. Perhaps because among the Sherpas particularly, these men, they have other interests in the sense they move about a great deal. They have to go with the yak up to the high altitude. Somebody has been in the house, so it's quite useful if your wife is not alone in the house, but your younger brother is there because he's also married to her. That may be one of the reasons. But another is, but I think in Indian families where there is polygyny, I mean, they're very often the women are jealous of each other for the sake of their children. If the son of one wife seems to be favored by the husband, then the other wife gets jealous. Now that cannot happen in polyandry because nobody knows who the father is of the children. The children are all belong to the brothers, the husband. Usually there are 2 brothers or a husband together. So there is not that extra possibility of becoming jealous because of jealousy over the attention given by the husband to the children. But why, you may ask, how do I know it works better? Quite apart from the observation that you don't seem to be many quarrels, and I've never seen 2 men quarreling, because you sometimes in polygynous societies you see the wives shouting at each other, etc. But that in the folklore, in the legends and tales, etc., of polygamous societies, I mean, there is very often the motive of the jealousy of the wife, the younger wife, or the poisoning the elder wife poisoning the younger wife, etc. Now, I have not found a single legend or story, fairy tale, of the joint husbands being in conflict. So I thought that that might be a fairly good reason why one might say it works more smoothly.
I wondered if you could say something about the economy of the Sherpas. When you first went there, what was their economic system?
Well, the economy of the Sherpas, indeed of other high altitude people, other Bhotia groups, whom I then later on studied in about similar altitudes. The economy is based on one hand on agriculture, although the period of cultivation, of course, is short between May and September, the only time when area is not under snow. So the one part of the economy is agriculture, the other is animal husbandry, and mainly the breeding of yak. And the third is trade, and because in these very high areas, without some kind of additional income, the population really could not survive. So they have to also, apart from breeding yak and growing buckwheat and potatoes, because much more you cannot breed at altitude, so they also were kind of intermediaries between, on the one hand, the grain growing areas of Nepal, and on the other hand, Tibet. And they were placed favorably near the high passes. So they transported the grain from the lower areas into Tibet, and they brought from Tibet such commodities as salt, mainly salt, and wool, and various other things to Nepal. So they were really both agriculturists and cattle breeders and traders. The difficulty arose, of course, when with the change of government in Tibet and the Chinese occupation of Tibet, for temporarily these frontiers were closed. And then the Sherpas had to look for other sources of income. And actually, it just happened that tourism developed in Nepal, and the Sherpas were able to make up for that shortfall by not only working for mountaineering expeditions, but also becoming tourist guides. And that has really completely changed the whole social situation in the Sherpa area in Khumbu and their economy. And as I just mentioned, I very recently was in Khumbu and went back to the same Sherpa villages where I had worked in the 1950s, and one could hardly recognize the society anymore, because now the men who work as tourist guides, they are only spending about 2 or perhaps 3 months a year in their villages. The rest of the time they are in other parts of Nepal or in Kathmandu. And so that certainly the social life is now no longer imbalanced. In the villages there are women and very old people and children, and the able-bodied men are all away from it's rather like sort of almost labor migration perhaps in Africa. So things have changed very much.
Yes, it is similar to quite a lot of those tribal groups there, with labour migration to the army and...
Yes, for instance, the Gurungs, whom you know so well, and where so many of the men are in the Gurkha regiments of the British Army, of the Indian Army.
Did you visit the Gurung territory?
Yes, I did. Indeed, I think I was the first anthropologist who did a little trip through the Gurung areas. And then it happened to be, you know the work, of course, of Pinye, whom I met in Kathmandu, and I advised to go to the Gorgs, which he did.
It was through you.
But I never published anything about Gorgs, but I found them very interesting.
Yes. What other groups did you visit in you mentioned the Botiers and...
Well, after I had more or less, after I had finished with the Sherpas, or had, let us say, completed my work among the Sherpas, I did a kind of exploratory tour through eastern Nepal, where I visited Rais and Limbus and the people on the Upper Arung and Walongchung. And again, in order to encourage students then to go to these areas. In the West, I did myself some little more intensive work among the Takaris of Takola, and then also visited Mustang, which again is an area under Tibetan cultural influence, which was very interesting. Then Dolpo, which is very probably the highest, where the villages are even higher as permanent settlements, higher than Sherpa villages I toured. And then I made a fairly extensive, several quite extensive tours into western and northwestern Nepal. And there again, for instance, in Humla, I did some work on the Bhotia people, again on the close to the Tibetan border, and made there some kind of study of the trade and the system of the trade, exchange of grain against salt, etc. So it was mainly the areas in high altitude, which I had once done a bit of exploratory work among the Nevas, because nobody had worked there. But that was at the very my first visit.
You worked among these high altitude peoples, many of whom were Buddhists or influenced by Buddhism, and you noted among the Sherpas the very heavy influence of the monasteries and the strong religious impulse. You don't ever, as I recall, speculate on why they should be so enthusiastic to set up monasteries and have so many nuns and monks. You ever?
Well, obviously one speculates, but I can't really have not a very definite answer to that. I think the reason is they are within the area of Tibetan Buddhism, after all. I mean, they speak a Tibetan dialect. They undoubtedly 300 or 400 years ago immigrated from Tibet into their present area of habitation, across the border. So they brought already a Tibetan Buddhist civilization with them. They continue to have close contact with Tibet. So they are really, it isn't that they suddenly invented, I mean, they decided we will all become Buddhists or something like that, or were converted to Buddhism. I think they already came with the tradition and maintained the tradition by their constant contact with Tibetan monasteries, and also, of course, trade with Tibet. Now that has changed now, because in Tibet monastic life has more or less been destroyed by the Chinese. But the interesting thing is that the Sherpa monasteries seem to flourish, and that is something which also for me is a bit of a problem. About 10 years ago, also I spent some time on Sherpas, and I then was a little disturbed because I found that the monasteries seem to have declined. The intake of new novices, etc., had come down. Now, to my pleasant surprise, I found that those monasteries I knew, like Tangboche Monastery, seem to have revived, and they have quite a lot of young novices, and the influence of the monasteries is quite strong again. Although everything else has changed in Khumbu, it may be that the greater prosperity which recently has come there through tourism and mountaineering made it possible to divert some economic resources to the monastery. I mean, it's quite expensive to keep so many people who are not involved in the economic process in monasteries, and so to say, feed them there. And that is, of course, easier for a society which is quite well off. And that seems to have happened again.
Well, Christoph, we've travelled with you round two ethnographic, or several ethnographic areas, and I wondered now whether we could talk more generally about your work and approach to anthropology. And firstly about the approach, the fieldwork approach. As you know, some anthropologists spend all their life studying one small island in the Pacific and then use this as a basis for vast theoretical schemes, or maybe a better example would be one small tribal group in South America. Others, like yourself, travel very widely. How would you advocate one approach or the other to widespread fieldwork or more detailed?
Well, I would say that I prefer and would also advise any student starting a career of anthropology to see various areas and not to concentrate on one or two only. I mean, I think it's quite essential that you get used to work for a long period in one society. I did that, for instance, among the Gonds. I spent initially about 3 years there. And certainly, if you do that, you get used to looking at all details, and you also realize that what you learn in the first 3 months you can largely discard, because as you go on you learn more and more about that society. So I think one should have once that experience, and it need not be 3 years. It is financially nowadays often impossible. On the other hand, I think it's very important to know many different societies, as different as possible. I mean, as different, for instance, Gonds and Sherpas of Nepal, or Chentus and Nagas, because then you realize that you just cannot generalize about human behavior. And you can't even say, if you study an institution, let us say like polyandry, that polyandry is like that. Because the polyandry of the Nayars of Malabar is quite different from the polyandry among the Sherpas. So I think it is really very important for an anthropologist to know a lot of different societies. And then there is, of course, another consideration too. I think as one gets older, I think you need continuously the stimulation of something new. Otherwise you can get very sort of, I wouldn't say bored, but you can, if you do not get that stimulation, your appreciation diminishes. I mean, I feel it now sometimes. I mean, only a few weeks ago, I went to Bihar, to Ranchi, not to do anthropology, but to visit a university, giving a talk, etc. And I was taken around to some of the Munda villages. And I thought, my God, how lucky I don't have to work there. I really couldn't sit down here and again study all the details. It seemed so familiar. I mean, not that I'd worked among Munda, but similar to others. While if I go to something new, let's say if I could start to do something in Bhutan, which I have only visited twice but never worked, I think I would have this kind of stimulation of something new. But then there's, of course, another consideration is, I think any anthropologist who spends a great deal of time in the field, I mean, let us say half almost his working time, I think will always more or less remain an a better or worse ethnographer, but basically an ethnographer. I think somebody who aspires to be a theoretician of the type of Lévi-Strauss and so on, then he probably should only see one little society, because then he hasn't got material in front of him which will combat his conclusion. And he will be quite happy to spin this kind of lovely fantasy which you can create if you have a very narrow base. And finally, really do philosophy. Philosophy stimulated by some experience with one or two people, but which is very different from a sort of comparison of a dozen of different societies belonging to different cultures like Tibetan Buddhism or Hinduism and so on. So I think it depends on your own personality. I think what is good for one student of anthropology may be bad for the other.
Thank you. Well, you advocated there a comparison in space as a basis for work. I wondered what you felt about comparisons in time, and particularly the idea that you seem to have practiced of revisiting again and again and again over long periods the same society, at least the same named peoples, yet not always the same society. Do you feel that's something that is valuable?
I think it's extremely valuable. I'm always amused if let's say I go to Kathmandu in Nepal, and a young man comes from Berkeley or Yale or whatever it is, and I ask him, what are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to study social change among the Nevars. He comes in 1982 or 83, he wants to study the change. The change from what? Because he hasn't seen what there was 20 years ago. So I think if you really want to study social change, you must allow a certain period to elapse so that you can see the stages of change. Now I think it is very revealing to go back to the same society, see a different generation, possibly also the same people, and see how are they when they are 30 years old or 40 years older. Because we don't remain the same. And so naturally Apatanis or Nagas and so on don't remain the same either. So I think this is very revealing, and I think it's quite important. I'm always rather surprised that on the whole relatively few anthropologists have done that. There are some who have. But the urge among senior anthropologists to go back to their own areas doesn't seem to be very great. It's particularly noticeable, for instance, among Indian anthropologists who are so near, and for them there's no expensive airfares and so on. They could easily sort of monitor the development of one society over a long period. But it's not done much. I think people find it perhaps a bit boring because they know what you expect. But I don't think it's boring. It might be depressing because you go back and you find they were much better off 20 years ago and now they're worse off. Or the very depressing people who were beautifully dressed in their originally dress, and now you all see them in jeans and bush shirts. But even that, of course, is an observation which is relatively perhaps important if we talk about even diffusion. I mean, diffusion of Western customs, diffusion of Western dress, of all that. And there we have the possibility of seeing it with your own eyes. So I think I think it's important. Of course, there's one factor, it is one has to live long enough. And you can't say somebody who dies at 35, he can't go back in his next reincarnation, perhaps.
I wondered, in fact, if you thought that if you hadn't made earlier visits, for example, I mean, you are a very good person to test this. If you hadn't visited the Sherpas as one of the first people who ever visited the Sherpas or the Apatanis or the Nagas, you were almost the first in all these cases. If you had in fact been a modern anthropologist who'd gone there 30, 20 years later, do you think, given the absence of historical records, you could have recreated by oral history or any other means what the society had been like 20, 30 years before?
I would think you could not have done that. Because certainly, for instance, Sherpa society has now changed so much. Of course, certain features of like the clan system or inheritance or things like that, but you couldn't have got the sort of atmosphere. You couldn't have refound or found at all, I mean discovered at all, the kind of spirit of the society. Similarly, for instance, among the Chenchus, I mean, I still saw them when they were hunters and food gatherers. Today they are still gatherers, but they don't gather for their own consumption. They gather for contractors, and they gather forest produce, which is then used by pharmaceutical industries. So both are gathering societies, but they are quite different. So I think what we do, any society we don't study today, any tribal society, a society which was isolated, you can't say, well, it can't be done now, but perhaps there's no particular hurry, it could be done in 20 years. Therefore, this I think is an argument also when anthropologists have to fight for funds, competing perhaps with archaeologists. Now, archaeologists, they can wait. Whether they dig out something which has been there for 10,000 years or 500 years, that can be dug out and studied any time. While the anthropologist who doesn't study a society now, he cannot do it in 30 years' time. I mean, he can still do a study, but then it's something totally different.
The fact that you were the first in many of these societies and that you did detailed studies makes these studies very, very valuable, merely as records of civilizations which have now disappeared. Many of them very early forms of society, as you explain. Therefore, I wondered if I could ask you about what in fact you collected in the way of a record and what recording there is, in other words the fieldwork techniques you used. When you first went to the field, there were no movie cameras or tape recorders, but did you just have notebooks or diaries? Did you take still photographs?
From the very beginning, I always took still photographs, and I took quite a lot of photographs, always. So that, of course, these records are in existence now. Then I had always hardback reporter diaries, and they still, not diaries, ordinary for the current fieldwork. I had also large diaries, also hardback, where I wrote every evening a diary. But otherwise, these reporter notebooks, they are still in existence now. And so even those notes which I did not use, for instance, we talked before that I did some work among Bondos and Gadabas, Austro-Asiatic speaking people in Orissa. Now I didn't publish much about them, I think 2 articles, but the notebooks are there. And I recently went back to the same village after 40 years, and the people says, oh yes, can you remember you camped under those trees there? And then of course, when you go back, it is absolutely invaluable if you have your, let's say, the house list. When I went now to Sherpa village, Kumjo, so 92 houses. Now I took my old notebook with me, I said what had happened to Konjichumbi, what had happened to Dorji Muktu, what had happened to his son, because I had all that there. So I could, in a very rapid time, very rapidly, I could reconstruct, so to say, what had happened in between to those families. So it's very important to keep your notebook and not to keep your notes on loose pieces of paper or type it out and on loose. You have to have something which is fairly solid, because none of us are so terribly careful with pieces of paper. But if you have it in solid notebooks and then diaries, of course, you can really keep it over a long period. Whether it is then very useful for other people, it may be in 50 or 100 years' time. If it's kept in a library, in an archive, may be useful. I doubt whether anybody would be very interested reading such things after 10 years. Although I have, when I suggested to students, my own students, to go to a particular place in Nepal, I usually lent them my notebooks for a few weeks, so that they could take notes of that and knew what might be interesting and what they might, for what they may look. So that is one thing. Otherwise, I think the method of fieldwork is probably cannot be taught, because everybody has slightly different ways of approaching people. There are certain features which I think is important. When you come to a village or any kind of group of people, I think you have to go and spend the first weeks on the boring job of making lists of the houses and finding out who is who and how are they linked and how do they fit together. I think that you must have, because then as your fieldwork goes on and things happen in the village, you can always ask who is that, and you can put them into that slot. It belongs to this family, this clan, etc. That is important. Therefore, it is rather, when one gets used to it, for instance, I worked in India, and they were always societies which have unilineal descent, either patrilineal or matrilineal. Then I once went to the Philippines, only for some comparative work. They haven't got that. So see, there is no unilineal descent. It's all sort of bilateral. So you can't, it's very difficult then, when you are used to do it in one way, then to switch over to quite a different way, because there you can't easily find out how is A related to B and X and so on, because they don't belong to the sort of same clan. They have a totally different and complicated network. So therefore I think it's quite complicated if you move to something totally different.
That is very helpful for people who are going to go out to do field work. I wondered if there was any other advice, looking back over your field work, which you would give to a young field worker who was going out, particularly obviously to work in India but elsewhere.
I think perhaps the most important advice is not to go with preconceived ideas and think, now I must find out data to prove the theory of Professor so-and-so, because I'm very interested in the theory, and also not only interested, I think that is a marvelous approach to anthropology and so on. So I must find material which will prove that theory or fit in. I think you must allow your theory to come out of your material. That is, I think you must go knowing obviously as much as you can about that part of the world or those society. If you go to one Naga tribe, it's useful if you read the books about neighboring tribes, obviously, but not to go with preconceived ideas that you want just study one particular part of that culture to follow up one specific theoretical line. Later on, when you have all your material, then of course you can do that. But I think it is very essential to come with a sort of have a very broad approach. Of course, you must have a reasonable time to sort of learn about all aspects of a society or a culture. But I think this is a piece of advice I would give to anybody.
You mentioned the hard and strong and durable notebooks, and also that you took a lot of photographs. Did you use any other recording devices, like tape recorders or movie cameras?
Yes. Movie cameras I used very early, already in 1940. I didn't have a movie camera among the Nagas when I was there in 1936, and I could have. They were not so light and easy to handle, but I could, but I didn't. But then I had a movie camera in 1940, and I did quite a lot of films. And I think this is, after all, a very useful way of documenting it, because whatever you see and write, it's quite different from when you see people moving. Also, it's very, if there's some complicated ritual, if you can actually take a film of it, you can see what is actually happening, what the sequence is. And in that respect, for instance, I found the help of my wife very useful, because I was taking the film, and she in the meanwhile was doing, describing, taking notes or so on. For one person, this is rather difficult. So then, of course, there's the question of tape recording. Tape recorders came in much later than film cameras, so my tape recorders I didn't have in all my early work, and that was a great handicap, for instance, when I was recording the mythology and epics and so on of the Gonds, because it took endlessly to transcribe it all in longhand. In their language, which is difficult enough, to listen to it and write, and you have to interrupt the narrator all the time. While with a tape recorder, you can get it down and you can play it to your informant and get the translation of the individual sentences. So that I did. I found also tape recorders very useful to record a conversation with somebody who is quite voluble and who tells you a lot, but you can't all take it down.
Christoph, you said that in justification of taking a whole lot of different societies in different cultural regions and religions and so on, one of the justifications was that it prevented you from making any rash generalizations about human nature and so on. And this fits in with one of the roles of anthropologists, which is to show that almost everything is culturally determined and almost nothing is natural. I wondered whether you could say something about two of the distinguished lectures which you gave and which were subsequently published in relation to general concepts. The first was the Henry Myers lecture on concepts of sin, and I wondered what your main conclusions from looking at sin and the concept of sin in tribal belief systems was.
Well, this is a very wide subject, but I could only say it confirmed me that different societies have very different concepts about morality, and that the very idea of sin in the Christian way, for instance, or in the Islamic way, is absent among many societies. Because in a society where, for instance, the gods, nearly every society has some ideas of supernatural being, God stated. Well, they don't really take very much interest in human morality. Obviously, there's not the concept of sin in the Christian way, that this is an offense vis-à-vis deity. So that, I think, came out of this comparative work quite clearly.
Did you find any correlation between a concept of sin and the idea that doing something would automatically anger some supernatural powers? Any correlation between that and the type of society? In other words, that very simple tribal societies, for example, like the Chenchus, didn't have a concept of sin, and yet stratified, settled agriculturalists did? Or did you find any correlation like that at all?
I would say no, nothing very obvious. I think one would have tried perhaps to look at many more societies, find out whether some correlation could be found. That you could do by literary study. I mean, you needn't go to all of them. But I wouldn't think so. I think perhaps when you come to very complex societies, sophisticated societies, it's more likely that there is a correlation, because there is the idea, if you in some way offend a supernatural being, a deity, is perhaps something also you would offend some authority in your own society. But on the other hand, I think, for instance, if you take even society like Hindu society, which is quite obviously, I mean, extremely sophisticated, has a complicated philosophy. The very idea of evil, for instance, in the Christian sense, it doesn't really hardly occur. I mean, there is no sort of, no figure of Satan in here, and yet you cannot say that Christian society is more sophisticated than Hindu society. I think it's very difficult to find, but one need perhaps be a philosopher of religion to say something very definite about this. But I think it's very worthwhile to do these comparisons.
Having shown that there is no indigenous concept of sin, a subject which many anthropologists, including Robert Hertz, as you mentioned, was interested in, connected to this was the subject of your Fraser lecture at Cambridge on the afterlife in Indian tribal belief. Because obviously the idea of sin is very related to your ideas of what happens to you after your death, particularly in Christian eschatology. What were the main features of the concepts of afterlife which you found particularly in the Nagas and Apatanis and the other tribal groups you worked with?
The interesting thing is that certain concepts, for instance, would be within a culture area, which I think Apatanis and Nishis and Nagas are. There would be certain similarities, even if the tribes are otherwise not so similar. So certain motives you would probably find. But again, we have here the question, what produces good results for the life after death? And take, for instance, the neighbors of the Apatanis, the Nishis, because there it's particularly clear. If you have killed many people, if you have married many wives, if you have taken slaves, if you have been successful in war, all things which are not considered particularly good in our society, Christian society, then you have a better chance in the next life, because you did something which was admired on this earth, I mean in this world, and would be also being admired in the next world. While the person who didn't do anything, any of these things, would be a sort of considered as of no importance. So I think there is a great difference. Society, like in Western society, where the idea is that your fate in the next world is not necessarily the same as here. I mean, if you acquired a great deal of wealth among the Apatanis, you will have a great deal of wealth in the next world. Here, if you gave away your wealth, or you didn't even acquire much, so that it is a kind of promise for perhaps you are rewarded for the things you didn't have. In tribal society, where the next life is really a repetition of this life, you will live again as you were living in this life. I mean, the big man will be a big man, the slave will be a slave, etc. So these are the differences.
So one of the main features you found was that, as Durkheim might have predicted, the afterlife was an almost exact, direct reflection of this life,
yes,
even down to the physical details of the afterworld, whereas in more in different systems it's often an inversion of this world, or it has no relation to this world at all. Was that the case in the Himalayan, the Nepalese areas you worked in as well, or was that just...
Of course, the Nepalese area where I was working was very much influenced by Buddhism. I mean, whether they were actually like the Sherpa, just sort of Tibetan Buddhists with all the concept of Buddhism, or whether they were only influenced. Nevertheless, there was very much the idea of you gain merit, and if you have gained merit, which is very much like lots of Christian type of merit, by leading a good life and giving charity and doing all those things, then you will have a better chance in the next life. Either having a good reincarnation or go at once to sort of the paradise in the Western world, etc. So there I think it was very clear that the ideas were influenced by one of the great historic religions. And I think wherever that is, the Apatanis now, they are getting a bit confused because some of their students have gone to universities like Shillong and Guwahati, etc., where there are Christian Kashis, Christian Assamese, and so on. So they hear a bit about that. And among the Apatanis, there was the idea that the good, I mean, the desirable life is in an underworld where everything is as it was on this life. And if you, not because of sins, but if you died an accidental death, drowning or being killed in war or eaten by a tiger or something like that, then you go up into a sky world which is not so desirable. Now, these people who have been seen Christian pictures of heaven with clouds and so on, and also pictures of hell down below, they get confused, of course. And one of elderly Apatani said, well, I'm not so sure as whether I really want to go down into the underworld. I think perhaps the life in the sky, maybe among the clouds, may be better.
Could I turn from that afterlife aspects to, you wrote a book on morals and merit, which was drawing together many of these features, and you had a chapter on the morality of war and vengeance, discussing the Naga morality and the blood feud and what you've talked about in relation to the Daphnes. there seems to be a very strong contrast between two of the areas you worked in anyway. The Dapla Naga area, where you get a lot of war, vengeance, blood feud, and honor and esteem emerges from killing, and the Sherpa Bhotia area, where you might have predicted, one might have predicted from other anthropological areas like the Bhutan area or the Atlas of North Africa, that pastoral peoples living in an inhospitable mountain terrain away from central government and so on might also have been violent, sheepful, yak stealing, vengeance filled, as they often are in other parts of the world. And yet you describe them as very, I think, very peaceful. I wondered whether you could say something about the contrast between the mentality and the social organization of these two areas, and why you think it might be that one is so peaceful.
I think this would definitely be the influence of Tibetan Buddhism, that they are so, that the mild person is admired, and the person who acquires merit by being nice to people, I mean, where killing even of animals is considered as sinful. So I think even if these people perhaps were a bit warlike before, I think they probably were under that dominating influence of Buddhism. I think they became what we might say much better, in the sense that they had much more regard for the other person, that they had the idea that it would be evened out in the next life. It wasn't necessary, for instance, to take revenge here, because the person who has done harmed other people, he would suffer in his next existence. So I think it may be that.
Could it also be related, if one was more economically deterministically minded, at all to the different economic systems, that in the north Assam is really a pocket with mountains around it, with very little traffic and trade through it, and it's a forest cultivating societies, and it's usually in these forest areas that you find very, very considerable headhunting and warfare and vengeance. Whereas one of the features of a trading peoples, like the people along the Himalayan areas, is that if you engage in too much vengeance, blood and so on, your trade tends to decline because people can't move around, they can't move through your territories. Do you think that a combination of Buddhism and the need to maintain quite amicable relations over long distances?
That may be something, but on the other hand, you have, for instance, the situation of the Pathans, who are pretty fierce in vengeance, etc., who also had some trade, and indeed depended on some trade. So a similar economy does not necessarily mean similar attitudes over such matters. I once did a comparative studies, because the Nagas have sometimes been compared with the hill tribes of northern Luzon in the Philippines. And indeed, so much in the material culture is so similar in these two areas. So many people had seen the Nagas, and many people had seen the Ifugaos and Igorots and Ilongots and so on in the Philippines, but there was no one person who had seen both. So I thought, well, it's not so far. I will go and spend a few months among these. They were also headhunters, etc., in the Philippines. And really, I mean, the economy and even material culture, down to textiles and irrigated rice on terraces like Tangam, were so similar that I would say, well, if I had been dropped there by a helicopter, I would have thought, I'm in a Naga village, but I don't know which Naga village, but it looks so similar. So all that was true, that was so similar. Then I came down to the social system and attitudes, etc. Totally different. you couldn't imagine two systems. I mean, the succession in the family and the bilateral system and so on, totally different. So that really gave me the idea that societies can have the almost identical economies, they can have almost identical material cultures, but for reasons we can only, we can't really understand. They are quite different in their social attitudes.
Yes. I wondered if I could end up by just asking you about one or two other people whose works you referred to or knew. Firstly, Brian Hodgson, who was, as you know, British resident in Kathmandu, and whose works you must have seen. Could you say just something about Brian Hodgson?
Well, of course, he died a long time ago, so I had no personal experience of him. But I think anybody who has worked on Nepal admired him for having been virtually the first who had attempted some kind of linguistic and some kind of ethnological work there. I mean, his early writings, they are quite important, and he was one of the few people who could go outside the Nepal valleys sometimes. So I think he's an important figure, but we don't know much about his personality as far as I know. I have never seen anything which would be diaries, which would show his character. So one can only say he was obviously one of those highly scholarly British officials, as they were in that period, quite a number, who made a basic contribution, but more I really wouldn't dare to say.
Thank you. The next person is not an anthropologist, but is a plant collector who is very widely esteemed now, one of the earliest explorers in the region. That is Kingdon Ward, who was buried at Grantchester near Cambridge here. I wondered if you knew Kingdon Ward.
I knew him quite well because I met him socially and in the Royal Geographical Society and so on. He was a very pleasant person, and he had, of course, a wide experience, particularly in areas which interested me, like in Northeast Frontier Agency, and he had traveled there in areas which are of considerable interest to anthropologists. He must have been an really intrepid traveler, and it must have been very difficult to keep really pace with him, because I think he undertook these travels with very little equipment, and he was very tough. And he wrote very well. I mean, his book, for instance, Assam Adventures, is really very vividly written. And I found it quite interesting because he mentions scenes he saw on the Tibetan side of people who were very similar to tribals I saw on the Indian side, and it seemed to be quite similar and so on. So he had very good sort of power of observation without being an anthropologist. But he was a remarkable man, there's no doubt about it.
Well, I think that would be a very good epitaph for you as well, Christoph, as we're ending. A remarkable man who was an intrepid traveller and wrote books of great power and interest. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you.